Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to talk to you about the force velocity curve. It is in chapter 7, and for the most part, you're going to find it on page 210. That's pretty much where it's explained. And you have figure 717. It is probably one of the most confusing areas. Well, there are a lot of confusing areas in chapter 7. It's one of the reasons why I know whenever I talk to students, they get to chapter 7, and if you have no background in biomechanics, kinesiology, sports type of training scenarios, coaching, things like that, most of this stuff is just, it's Greek. You have no idea. And I hear it all the time. And I want to kind of ease some of the inevitable confusion that you may have while you're doing it or before you even get to it. So let me kind of explain a little bit about what NASM is trying to help you to understand. So in chapter 7, which is the HMS, or the Human Movement Science chapter, they're trying to take a tremendous amount of information, a huge field of study, which you can focus on for the entirety of a career, and collapse it into a couple of pages, a couple of areas here, a couple of areas there, and they try to do it in a way that is not going to overwhelm you. You're going to get overwhelmed no matter what. And the force velocity curve, like again, a number of these issues, force couple relationships, all of these topics, these concepts are somewhat important, but from a testing perspective, and when I say somewhat important, I mean in athletic training. And this is where the rub kind of comes in. For the most part, as a personal fitness trainer, you're simply not going to be dealing with, for the most part, athletes. And I'll just help you right from the get-go so you don't take this too far. The force velocity curve from a conceptual standpoint, or even from a practical standpoint, is really only used in athletic training programming. It's designed to help athletic trainers, determine through the macro cycles of an athlete's annual periodization schedule where they should be focusing some of their training. In other words, when should I be doing strength training? When should I be doing power training, speed training, yada yada, all of these different components of an annual periodization schedule. And by the way, you'll see that later on in the textbook. But the concept of the force velocity curve is simply designed to help a coach trainer to determine where and what they should be doing with their particular athlete when it comes to the programming, their training. How do I ultimately develop greater explosiveness? And this is where you got to take a step back and understand NASM is trying to give you a sort of, a broad spectrum of information. Again, in general, you're simply never going to use anything related to the force velocity curve in any real situation with the average client, which is 99% of you. If you ever do get into some sort of higher level athletic training, and I'm including even high school athletes, college level athletes that are not at the apex of their sport, but anybody that is looking for more extreme levels of performance, then understanding this concept, and by the way, a little different than what NASM has here, is really, really important, because again, from a programming perspective, we're in chapter 7, and they're trying to give you information that you could potentially use and look at later on in the textbook. But this information, for the most part, is generally used only by athletic trainers and those individuals trying to help athletes increase performance, and in most cases, explosiveness and injury reduction. With that said, right now it's pretty straightforward, I would think, when it comes to how you should be studying and understanding this for what? For your test. Again, when you're going through this textbook, and particularly these areas, keep in mind the goal is to answer questions related to what they have in the text. Do yourself a big favor. Don't go out and start Googling force velocity curve. It's only going to confuse you more. It really will. Remember, these are areas of study that are very specific Now, generally in biomechanics, but very specific to the athletic training arena. So again, with that said, what then do you need to know about the force velocity curve? It's really pretty simple. And here's what I want you to understand. The figure that they have given you is, for the most part, all you really need. Now, let me explain what NASM is showing you in figure 717. It says force velocity curve. Now, remember, we're dealing with an X, Y axis, a coordinate system. It is not, conceptually, this is not difficult. NASM made it, in my opinion, more difficult than it needed to be, because because here they're simply focusing on the speed of contraction of the muscle. The confusion is that when, for instance, when I learned this way back when in college, we learned this, but we learned this component after we learned the simplest component, which is the very basic idea that there is an inverse, meaning when one goes up, the other goes down. When one goes up, the other goes down. When one goes down, the other goes up. That's called an inverse relationship. I don't think that confuses most folks. And so what you first learn is that the force velocity curve is generally easy to understand from an exercise movement perspective. So when you do a squat, how fast do you go down? How fast do you go up? You do a deadlift, how fast do you lift up? How fast do you go down? When you're doing a lateral raise, how fast, right? The movement velocity. This is generally the easiest way to understand the force, and the velocity curve is the speed of movement of an exercise. And when I talk to students that are confused about this, they're like, well, I don't understand. What does it mean if my bicep and I'm doing a curl and I've got to stop them and go, okay, there's two ways to understand force velocity. Two basic ways. One is the force is easy, right? The force component of this is easy. It's the velocity part, force and velocity. And there's two ways to understand this. You can see it as the velocity of the contraction of the muscle. So the muscle itself is contracting quickly or contracts slowly. Now, there's the other way of understanding this, which is actually what makes more sense in the real world, which is the velocity of the particular limb or limbs that you're doing an exercise on. So I can talk about the force velocity curve related to the quadriceps, right? Okay, that doesn't help me a whole lot in a sense, not in the real world, but I can also more practically understand force velocity related to the speed of a squat focused on the quadriceps. I hope that makes sense. So the general confusion that we see is that, in my opinion, my humble opinion, is that what NASM should have done was they should have given you a little intro to force velocity and make sure that there's a separation with the picture, because here all we're doing is looking at a picture. And of course, when we're looking at a XY variable chart like this, and you've got two lines, one going this way and one going this way, and you're talking about an eccentric and a concentric contraction, there's nothing wrong with that scientifically, but it's exceedingly confusing. And if you are confused, that's the whole point. First off, understand there is and this is from a testing perspective. Now, if you want to learn and keep going and understanding better and better, that's fine. But I'm trying to get you to deal with the questioning component on the exam, which is basically that there is an inverse relationship between the force that a muscle develops and the speed at which the muscle shortens and or lengthens. Okay, so there is an inverse relationship between the force or the essential tension generation that a muscle can generate and the velocity that particular muscle is going to move at. Now, what I want you to do is, on that little table, this little figure, I want you to look at, there's a blue curve and there's an orange curve. Forget the orange curve for a second. Okay, just don't look at the orange curve. Just look at the blue curve for a second. I want you to get an idea of what we mean when we say an inverse relationship. Now, the inverse relationship for the movement speed is generally what makes the most sense. We say that if you drop down quickly in a squat or you go up quickly or whatever the case is, there's a certain amount of force that's generated. This blue curve, what NASM did is they went with the muscle contraction speed, not the movement. So what I want you to understand is that from a questioning perspective on the NASM exam, they're not going to be talking from this perspective about the movement speed of a squat, how fast you go up, how fast you go down. No. They're talking specifically about the muscle, whatever muscle you are talking about, just the muscle itself, not the movement. And I hope that clears up some of the confusion. So what they focused on was not movement of a dumbbell curl or movement of a lateral raise. They're just focusing on the deltoid or the bicep or the tricep, one muscle. I hope that makes sense. And so if you look at the blue, this is what's known as an inverse relationship. You'll notice on the y-axis, that blue curve starts very high on the y-axis. And since the y-axis is the force, right? The force is very high, right? So the force is high. You can see the arrow goes up. So the force starts very high, but where is the velocity? On the x-axis. The velocity is all the way over to essentially zero. So basically, you can see that when the force is maximized, the velocity of the muscle contraction is going to be minimized. Hope that makes sense. Force, very high. Velocity, very low. Okay. But you'll notice that as that blue line moves down and over across the x-axis, it goes down a point right in the middle of that graph. And when you go up, you'll notice that the force is a certain level, but its velocity is significantly higher. And so on the blue curve, you're going to notice that there's an inverse relationship. When the force is really high, what is the velocity? It's very low, right? Because it's zero on the x-axis. As the force goes down, the velocity increases. That's called an inverse relationship. So where is the confusion coming in? It's that orange line. Okay, what did you notice with the orange line? Well, with the orange line, it's the exact opposite. And basically what NASM is trying to help you to understand that is when we look at a muscle, it can go through either a concentric or shortening contraction or an eccentric lengthening contraction. And boom, there's the confusion. Now people go, what are you talking about? And this is why I want to draw you away from trying to fully understand and conceptualize this into understanding something very, very basic. When you focus on the actual contractile speed of an individual muscle, you have to take into account that there's two types movement contractions in the muscle. And you learn this, the concentric or the shortening, and the eccentric or the lengthening part of the contraction. And all NASM is trying to let you know is that during a concentric, the concentric component of the contraction, the blue line, during the concentric, we have this normal, what we consider to be a normalized inverse relationship. During the concentric contraction of a muscle, forget doing a dumbbell curl, forget doing a squat. Just think about pulling the bicep off of your arm and putting it on two ends and shortening and lengthening, shortening and lengthening. Well, what we know is, especially by this chart, is that if we increase the total force of the concentric component of the contraction, the actual velocity of the shortening is minimized. Now, that simply means that now if we reduce the force that the muscle produces, the muscle can actually shorten faster. Okay? Again, this is confusing because the first thing you do is you immediately equate that to what? A dumbbell curl. So I guess if I curl up faster than this, I create more force. Well, not necessarily, because there's mechanical elements to this that are going to throw a wrench in the machine. That's why what they're focusing on is just the muscle itself. So the force velocity is not the movement speed of an exercise. Velocity means the actual speed of contractile capability through the concentric or the eccentric. So the blue curve is an inverse relationship, but what is the orange curve? Well, it's actually not an inverse relationship. It's just the opposite. During the eccentric phase of a muscle, the lengthening component of it, you actually have the exact opposite scenario, which is why I don't particularly like the chart, and it doesn't really help a personal trainer, but that's just my opinion. But you got to know it and you got to understand it for them, because it's their textbook and it's their exam. So answer the question based on the information they've given you. When a muscle is lengthening under tension, when a muscle is going through an eccentric contraction, the faster that eccentric contraction occurs, the greater the force. Okay, so you got concentric, you got eccentric. When the speed of the contraction during the concentric contraction occurs, what happens to the velocity? It goes down. Okay, so velocity and force. Force high, velocity low. Force goes down, velocity increases during the concentric. With the eccentric, it's the exact opposite. When the force production of the eccentric is low, speed or velocity is low. Force is low, velocity is low. Force is high, velocity is high. You get the way this works. One is an inverse relationship and the other is not. So two variables, force, velocity. What do I want you to know from a testing perspective? If they ask you force, velocity inversely related is concentric. During the eccentric, it's the same. Force and velocity go up at the same time. Force and velocity go down at the same time. Okay. So I guess I could have done this video in like 5 seconds. But the point is I don't want you to get confused. I don't want you to go out on, again, I don't want you to go out on Google and start, going so deep into this that you go beyond what NASM wants you to know from a testing perspective. Again, the force velocity curve in this textbook is this much information, and that's it. And don't go beyond that. In reality, we don't generally use this from a programming perspective. From a programming real world perspective, we don't care about the muscle itself. We're concerned about an actual exercise. We're concerned about squats, because when I do programming, I don't do my programming from a periodization perspective using muscle concentric and eccentric movements. No, I do squats. I do dumbbell curls. I do power cleans. I do presses, whatever the case is. So my focus is not so much on a particular muscle, it's on movement. So remember, force velocity curves are for the most part going to function with a single, in this case, the blue curve, to express or explain explosive capabilities during an exercise like a bench press. Explosive exercises like a shoulder press. Explosive exercises like coming from the bottom of a squat up. That force velocity curve is on the force and the velocity of a particular movement through what would be the concentric contraction. NASM here is saying, we're not interested in the movement stuff. We want to look at the muscle, right, in isolation. And when we look at the muscle in isolation from a testing perspective, concentric contraction versus eccentric, concentric has an inverse relationship between the force produced by a particular muscle and the velocity of that particular muscle during the concentric, right? It's an inverse relationship, but it's exactly the same, right, during an eccentric, force velocity. Okay, look, if you have questions, well, let's do it this way. If you actually understood it, then write the word understood or understand in the comment section below. If you want more information on the entirety of this textbook, every chapter, video and audio components, along with quizzes and practice exams, then go ahead and click on the link below in the discussion box, right? Comments, understand. If you understood it, if you're still confused by it, then right, still confused. And maybe I'll be able to explain it a little bit better in a future video. Also, keep in mind every Wednesday night, 6 to 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. So Central, Mountain, Pacific, you got to subtract your time. You know what time it is. 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 to 6:30. We do Quizlet live. It's a great way to learn the terms and concepts, and it's a lot of fun. So come on board. By the way, if you have not done so, head on over to our Facebook page. If you're watching this through the Facebook page, make sure you go and check out our YouTube channel as well. As always, we are here to help you to pass your NASM exam. Let us know how we can be of assistance by writing a comment down below. Have a great